Hi, welcome to another episode of Elsa Heron. My name is Rob Runacres, and I'm joined by my friend Hans Jodlind, who will introduce tonight's episode.
Yes, hello. Tonight we actually have Mike Edelson from New York. Hello, Mike. How are you?
Hi, Hans.
Hey, Mike.
Pleasure. Rob.
Okay, Mike, can you just start to begin by explaining why you feel that HEMA practitioners should cut with sharp swords? Because that's, of course, why we have you on the show, to talk about test cutting.
Oh, so we're diving right into the deep stuff? We don't want to talk about me? Okay, fine. Yeah, so I guess it really depends on why you're practicing HEMA. If it's to practice the historical art, then the simple answer is we have to be able to do what the period masters were able to do. And they were able to cut. So if we can't, then we're not doing what they could do. That's really all there is to it. I mean, it's just that simple.
Okay. Are we doing it right so far?
We can't use their same methods, right? Because then we'd all end up in prison. Although prison HEMA, I think, would be pretty cool. Because every night we'd have some informal tournament. The guards would come and bust it up, and it'd be great. But yeah, so for us, the methods that they use are a little bit less important than achieving the same results.
Yes.
Because even if we knew exactly what those methods were, I mean, we'd be able to do some of them, but probably not all of them.
Okay. Well, you say that we need to, be exactly like the historical masters. How far do you feel this is actually a reenactment, and how far do you feel that this is a practical application of sword techniques?
Well, I mean, actual sword techniques have no practical application. Although here in America, when someone breaks into your house and you have a sword, it's happened a few times. There can be, but that's a statistical anomaly. In reality, there are no practical applications. What we're doing is sportive, and that's why a lot of people focus on the sportive applications, because that's really, the only thing you could actually do. Everything else is you know that castle they're building in France, using medieval techniques?
Yes, indeed. Yep.
Yeah. So that's how I look at what we're doing in HEMA. So we can build a castle with cranes and bulldozers and cement in a few days, right? But these guys are taking years to do it with pulleys and ropes and yardsticks and all that kind of stuff. They're actually hauling stones. Why are they doing that? They're doing that so that they can learn how people back then built a castle, because that's useful information academically. And I see that the way I see HEMA is we're doing the same thing. We're trying to figure out, learn, and recreate how those people in the 15th, 16th, 14th, or whatever century you're interested in were doing HEMA. So there's that element of it, and there's the practical application. They don't have to be separate. I mean, they could be one and the same.
But to be clear, you're not doing something like reenactors in Europe would do, or I suppose if the SCA in America are doing. You're not going for the whole period dress or anything like that. You're interested in the weapon as a tool and in the applications of that weapon.
Right, and I respect reenactors. Well, European ones, not so much some of the American ones. But that's a valuable thing to do also, because it's going back to the castle. They could build that castle wearing blue jeans and T-shirts, using medieval techniques, or they could go, the full Monty and dress up in. Did I use that? Is that a British term? Did I use that right?
A full Monty, I believe, comes from Britain, but yes, carry on.
Yeah. So they don't have to do it in a reenacting sense. They don't have to wear medieval costumes. They don't have to go back to their hovels at night and make love to their ugly British wives, or is it French in this case? But you can divorce the actual practical research that they're doing from the reenactment, although both have value.
Okay, so when we talk about cutting, it's more than just swinging a blade at the target. Can you just take us through the whole procedure for making a really for doing good cutting?
Okay, so there's two elements of a cut. The one is delivering the cut to the target, right? And so that has all the tactical considerations that most people in HEMA are already very familiar with, right? Not telegraphing your movement, setting up a strike correctly, landing it where you want it to land, etc. But then there's the other dimension of what happens when that sword makes contact with your opponent. So in a tournament, you can stop caring at that point, right? Because you've made contact with your opponent, you've gotten your point, and That's it. But if you want to rebuild the castle using pulleys and yardsticks, then you've got to worry about what's going to happen when that hit strikes the target. And then you have, the trajectory of the sword. Is it straight? Is there enough velocity? Is your tip leading? Is it going to bite into the target, or is it going to drag along the surface of the target? Like, for example, some of those very curved swords from the Middle East that will deliver a long but shallow wound. Or will it actually bite deep and you deliver a potentially more mortal wound? Is it going to turn in the target? Is it going to get stuck in the target? Is it going to exit cleanly? Because if you can cut someone and your sword's kind of stuck in their shoulder, you better hope that they're the only person you're fighting with and that they don't have a couple of seconds of life left to exact their little revenge. But there's a lot of considerations. Mostly it's about velocity, trajectory, and structure, meaning follow-through.
Okay. What kind of targets do you use when you test cut? What do you think we should use?
We should use anything that's consistent and delivers the full range of information that you need to determine if your cut is effective. Right now, the only thing I know that does that is tatami.
Okay.
I mean, if someone... sorry.
Sorry. No. And historically, what did people test cut on? I mean, we know the pre-tests and manuals. Yes, we see techniques where people put swords through people's heads and cut people's arms off, but they also did test cutting, right?
Well, I mean, Matt Gallis is always digging up new things, but we don't know what the medieval Europeans or the Renaissance Europeans used. Later on, people used clay and or straw, maybe separately, maybe mixed all together. Executioners used to practice on, what is that vegetable called?
Yeah, rhubarb.
Rhubarb.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think that's more for aim, because rhubarb is fibrous, but it's pretty, not resistant. Clay is a useful medium. If you have a lot of it, you can test your follow through and velocity with it. But so the thing about cutting is that you don't actually have to cut things to practice cutting. So, like, a lot of people will say, well, the Europeans didn't test their cutting. And that's fine. If we find that they didn't do anything, then that's okay. Because once you know how to cut, once you know all the elements of it, all the dimensions, how to analyze something, then you could just practice swinging your sword through air, as long as you know what to look for. The cutting stuff is actually to calibrate you. It's kind of like, say you have a laser rangefinder, right? So you want to make sure it's calibrated correctly. So when it tells you it's 800 meters away, it's actually 800 meters. Look, I'm using European measurements. Is it? Okay, instead of yards. So, yeah. So let's say you don't know what it's set to. So you find a known distance, like 800 meters away. You shoot your laser at it. It comes back with 750. So it's 15 meters off, right? So you dial it up 50. You shoot it again. It comes back with 800. So now you know from that known distance that it's calibrated. And cutting is the same way. You think that you're doing it right when you're swinging through the air, but unless you're actually sure, you need to calibrate. So you swing at a target. You see your results. You say, well, I'm lacking in this regard. Maybe I scalloped it a little bit. My trajectory isn't straight. So now when I swing through air, I need to make sure that the path I'm following is a straight path. And then you do that for a while. You come back, and then you find another issue. So you correct that issue, and so on and so forth. A really good teacher doesn't really need for you to cut to see your problems. But it helps.
Okay. If we can just pull this back a bit, for the uninitiated, you have a tatami target. Can you... and obviously that can be positioned and angled or whatever, however you want it. But we are talking during this episode, from your perspective, at the beginning at least, from the longsword. Yes. Could you just describe what the process would be to actually cut? Perhaps how the target is set up and how one approaches it and actually does the cut, or the methods by which you do it.
Okay, so you set the target. First, you prepare the target. You roll it, you soak it. Soaking it gives it weight and density, so it doesn't bounce around as much. It also makes it, I don't want to say more flesh-like because tatami is not a flesh simulator, but it does make it a little closer, better calibrated. You set it up on a stand so that it's nice and solid, so it doesn't, you don't flick it and it falls over. Although if you're really good, it could just be, barely teetering, and you don't need it to be on a spike or anything. Then you approach your target. And one of the things we stress is you don't hop around and shuffle your feet, get ready, because you're not going to do that in a fight, right? So part of the usefulness of cutting is that you should be doing it all the time, right? So if you have to take special preparatory motions before you can cut, unless you're doing some special feat where you're trying to, like, cut 5 criminals in half. It's not very useful. So, you approach the target as you would approach an opponent. I don't mean hop around. I mean just, walk up to it without any shuffling, raise your sword, and cut it. And then what happens is the instructors watch what happens to the target, right? What happens to the piece that you cut? Does it fall down cleanly or does it go flying, right? So that can tell us, for example, is the energy of your sword, is it directed along its trajectory, or is some of your energy pushing the sword sideways as it goes along its path, right? So that's wasted energy. That creates friction in the target. It's more likely to get your sword stuck. So that's one thing. Then we look at the severed piece, right? Is it a nice clean cut along the angle that we wanted, right? And the angle itself is not important. If we tell you cut 60 degrees, you should cut 60 degrees. If we tell you cut 40 degrees, you should cut 40 degrees. Whatever it is we tell you should be able to control your angles. We look at where on the target you should be able to hit what you're aiming at. We look at, like I said, the part that was cut. Is it nice and flat, right? Is it tilted a certain way? From that we can read, what are you doing with your hands? Is one hand maybe pushing and pulling? Is one hand twisting one way while the other hand is twisting the other way? And all of these things manifest in the actual target. So it's not important that you just cut through the target. That's a given. That's like walking into the room, right? That's what cutting through the mat is. Once you walk into the room, what do you do there? And that's where the results come in.
Okay.
Okay, and what about the sword itself? I mean, obviously one has to sharpen the sword, but is there a particular methodology one should use, and can we actually tell anything from the target about the quality of the sword?
The sword should be sharp, right? Because people in medieval Europe wore clothing, right? And several layers of clothing. So a sword that isn't extremely sharp is not going to penetrate several layers of linen and wool. It's just not. It's going to bounce off. And if they wanted to make a bludgeoning weapon, there were more effective ways of doing it than making swords. So knowing that you want the sword so sharp, well, a certain degree of sharpness. For example, I like to be able to shave hairs off my arm. And that seems absurdly sharp, but it's really not. It's not that hard to get. You're talking about the same, roughly 40-degree edge bevel that Peter Johnson tells us is correct for medieval swords. There's a range. He doesn't, but he tells us a certain range, and you want it in that range. Other than that, really the purpose of cutting is to evaluate your technique. Well, today anyway, not the sword, right? So as long as the sword cuts through tatami in a way, if your cut is good, right, tatami should offer you very little resistance. Like you shouldn't need a lot of power. You shouldn't need to overswing. It's just nice and clean, and the sword has to be sharp enough to facilitate that.
Is there anything when you're doing repeated cutting? Is there any way in which you look at, say, for how long the sword retains its sharpness?
I mean, yeah. I mean, that's we look at that from a practical perspective because we don't want to keep sharpening these things, and we look at that from a curiosity perspective. Even though modern steel, is not the same, and modern heat treatment is not the same as period heat treatment. But we maintain the swords with leather belts, like stropping them. We occasionally resharpen, but they seem to, modern steel holds its edge for a very long time, if properly sharpened.
We should just say here, are there any particular makers of swords that you feel produce swords that are perhaps superior for cutting?
We mostly use Albion swords. Arms and Armor makes some good stuff also, but Albion focuses more on medieval swords than they do. And so, they have a large variety of good medieval longswords to choose from. And, they're designed by Peter Johnson, who I think is probably the world's foremost expert on medieval swords. So that helps.
Okay.
Have you done any test cutting with rapiers or that kind of weapons?
I mean, I don't study rapier, but I have one, so I've played around with it. But rapier, the goal of cutting with a rapier is different, right? You're not trying to hack off someone's arm or bury your sword in their torso. So if you want to talk about test cutting with rapier, you'd have to figure out what your goals are, right? How to measure whether those goals would work in a consistent way, and then create a cutting program for that weapon. We haven't done that. No.
I suppose one of the things is also, as we've mentioned in previous episodes, there's a huge variety of what we would call the rapier. Right. So the shorter Spanish rapier is used for cutting considerably more than, say, the early 17th century long rapier, which is predominantly a thrusting weapon.
So yeah, for that, you would probably be able to use it the same way. Depending on how slender or delicate the blade is, or not slender, you might have to adjust your target. You could start with a thinner roll, see how that works, and go from there.
Okay. Safety, of course. We are dealing with extremely dangerous instruments. What sort of safety elements do you feel should be in place as a minimum?
You have to take the sharp sword very seriously. You can't treat it like a toy. You can't be swinging it around when there's people, near you. So we have people, very ceremoniously, if you want to call it that, go to the starting position, right? Everyone, backs away. If a person, like for example, flubs a cut and the target bends down and it has to be fixed, we don't want that person touching it because the target is wet and then their hands will be wet. And then, so the person then backs away from the target. The people who come adjust the target. Once they have retreated, then the person is again allowed to approach. And we treat safety violations very seriously, particularly in the larger tournaments like Long Point, where if you violate one of the safety guidelines, you might actually be ejected from the entire event because at that point you have shown yourself to be a dangerous lunatic.
What about screening?
Say that again?
What about screening, say, clear perspex screening or something like that, some sort of, because obviously when you mentioned the tournaments, you have a large audience participation in addition to other competitors and the judges. Is there any sort of screening that should be used?
Oh, screening. I thought you said screaming. No, well, I mean, HEMA is small enough at this point that we all know each other. So if there are dangerous lunatics among us, we figure it out early. And if we feel that...
What about a sword slipping out of someone's hand or a sword break or something like that? It's not the attitude of the individual that's in question, maybe, but actually the act of God type thing that could happen.
It could. That's why we have strict standards for what kind of swords you could use. We allow Albions because they're very well made. We'll allow other swords, and we still inspect the swords that are used. But things could still happen. A sword could have metal fatigue that you can't see, and something could snap off. So we try to position a table in such a way that in the audience, such a way that if a piece goes flying, it's not likely to hit someone. But anything could happen. I mean, it's a dangerous activity. Not much has happened yet. We've had one small injury so far, but that's for the number of tournaments that we've done and the number of people that have cut, that's a really good record.
Well, what small injury was that?
Oh, someone doing an Unterhau, which is a cut from below going up, clipped their foot a little bit, but it wasn't serious, and it wasn't anyone's fault. It was just the sword was long. The foot might have been an inch to the left or whatever. It's something that can happen. It's no one's fault, but thankfully nothing serious happened. We do have safety rules. For example, you can't cut over your leading leg, which means that if your left leg is forward, you don't cut towards it from right to left, right? So things like that mitigate some of the risks.
From this, then, what do you suggest to people who wish to get into test cutting? Because obviously, I imagine there's a great temptation for people to get their sword, whatever it is, their blunt, sharpen it up, and just start chopping at things.
Try to get some sort of guidance, because if you just start cutting, then you don't really know what you're cutting for, and you think that I'm back in the day, I'm guilty of this. Before I had any formal training when I was young, you get a target, you cut it, and you're like, yeah, I cut the target, but you don't really know anything beyond that. And so you start to develop, you start to do the opposite of what cutting should do, which is you start to develop, you start to make your technique worse and less historical rather than better and more historical.
Yeah. Okay. About Long Point, you have been running that cutting tournament for some years now. Will there be any changes this year? Because I seem to remember that you wrote something on Facebook some time ago that you were going to change something.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about that? What are the changes and everything?
So, one of the things I've tried to do from the beginning is to guide training along the path that I think it should follow, which is closer to, so that our cutting goals would be to bring us closer to the historical ways of using a sword. So I made some mistakes in the early tournaments, and I've tried to back away from it, and things have been going pretty well now. But what I've been seeing is that people are starting to focus on that single tatami target as their goal, right? And our goal is not to cut, soaked Japanese carpeting, right? That's not what we should be doing. Our goal should be to learn to use our swords in a historical manner. The tatami is, like I mentioned before, a feedback and calibration device, right? So if you're focusing your skill on that target, you're not doing yourself any favors as far as being a historical martial artist. For example, we measure, I told you, the trajectory, so it's nice and flat, right? Well, the tatami target is only about that big, right? So let's say your cut comes in a circle, right? But where it happens to cross the tatami, it looks flat, right? So your cut looks good, but it's really not, right? Or, for example, one of the ways in which mistakes and problems are introduced is when you add power to a cut, right? Anyone can take a sword, swing it gently through the air, and make it perfectly straight, hold their hands the right way, once you know what that is, right? So adding power is where your mistakes happen. So if people get a really good sword and put a really good edge on it, and they're focusing on that one target, then they're able to not put as much power into it as you would against an opponent. So that's an artifact, for example. Then they get away with sloppier technique or lack of technique, or even if their technique is good, we as judges would have no way of making sure. So what I'm going to be doing at this long point is increase standards, right, and adding multiple targets. For example, one of the things you're going to have to do is cut 2 mats, and they're going to be spaced apart, right? Mm-hmm. So if your trajectory is like this, curved, right, but it happens to be straight in one small area, we're going to see that. Because one mat might be straight, and then the other one, so they might look like this, right? Mm-hmm. Where you cut this, but then came up, and and so we'll be able to detect that better.
Okay, just for to kind of summarize something there, can you actually explain how cutting is judged and perhaps how points are allocated, at least within the competition rule set that you use?
Sure. Basically, we have this idea of what a good cut is, right? I mentioned some of these before: straight trajectory, all the power directed along the path, sword nice and flat to make sure you're doing even things with your hands, because you can get away with that on a single mat target, but again, if you put a bunch of them together, if you cut something denser, like for example a human torso, you won't get away with it. So we look at what a perfect cut should be, and we give that a baseline score of 0, right, or full score, whatever, and then we subtract penalties from any mistakes that you make, so that the more mistakes you make, the lower your score is. And these mistakes they're not arbitrary, right? They're things that would actually affect your cut where you attempt to deliver it against an opponent.
Okay, and that includes, does it, the manner in which you walk up to the target?
It hasn't before, because one of them, when we started this in 2012, one of the issues was, people had different interpretations, right? And at that point, HEMA was still, it's not as developed as today. We're always going to be able to say that, right? 5 years from now, we'll say that in 2016, HEMA was not as developed as it is today. So we didn't feel as comfortable passing judgment on people's, the way they interpreted how they should approach, how they should swing, should they, do a little moulinet before they cut, and all that kind of stuff. Now, we feel comfortable saying, no, you're wrong, you're bad, you should feel bad, and we're going to penalize you. So now we're going to be doing that, but that's gradually evolved from. We used to subtract a few points for little, what we call form dings, where if you shuffle your feet, you lose a little bit of your score. Now I'm flat out saying that if you shuffle your feet, you're pretty much done. And so things like that.
Okay.
Okay. Now the cutting scene is obviously picking up in Europe. Would you have any general advice for the Europeans on this?
Yeah, don't try to do it yourselves. I mean, you can. You totally can. And you'll make all the same mistakes we made, and it will take you longer. But don't do that. We're here. Have us help you. when we saw that we were lacking in certain things, you know, we brought you guys over and you helped us. So we're ready to return the favor. Just ask.
Okay, cool. Mike, we brought you to this interview not only to talk about test cutting, actually, because we wanted to see and talk a little bit about some other stuff that you do, which is writing, right? And you have a book with swords, actually, and fencing.
Yes.
Can you?
Well,
do you have it there? Can you show us, or?
Well, there's two actually that I want to talk about, and the first one is the one that I haven't finished, and that's the Longsword cutting mechanics book that I'm working on, which I will be done by this long point, I swear, this time. And you mentioned earlier, like, what I recommend for people who want to get started with it. Get that book. Not because I want to make money from it, although that would be nice. Because you know that it can help you. You know, how to get started, what to look for, what to do. It's better to have someone show you, right? Because you know you can write 100 words, and those words will be packed with a certain meaning that you intend, but that's not necessarily the information that someone else might get out of it. So a book is never as good as, you know, live instruction, but it's a start. So you know, if people want to get started in cutting, that could be either a how-to guide or a reference guide, or a, you know, even a solo study guide for someone that doesn't have anyone to teach them.
Okay. And you're hoping to get that out for July of 2016 this year.
Well, you know, I've been saying that for a while. Every year it's been ready by this long before. But hope that's the plan. You know, that's the intention. So.
Cool. Very good. Thanks. Okay, Rob.
Well, yes, I believe you have some other books. I interviewed your doppelganger in the Purple Heart Open, who explained about your writing, yes. Josh Paris. But perhaps it's time you actually explained what it is you've written.
Okay, so I mean, I've written a bunch of books, but for HEMA, of interest to HEMA people, is this one. All right, it's called the. You can see there's an Albion brushless Spadona on the cover. Yeah. So this it's basically a thriller, right? A suspense thriller, whatever you want to call it, and it takes place in a fictionalized version of our community, and any resemblance to actual persons is purely coincidental. Although when the characters go to the zoo and look at the gorilla exhibit, that's totally Josh Paris. before they shaved him and let him go. There's no zoo. So and a lot of people have really enjoyed this book. People have read it. They've reacted very strongly to it, mostly positively. Some people actually took some offense at the what they call the glorification of murder. But the book is actually it's not just a you know, a fun romp through the adventures of sword wielding maniacs. It asks some pretty deep questions about why we do what we do and what that means to us individually. And for the most part, that has you know, it's gone along well with those people that have read it. Some people have actually, you know, ranted and raved about how much they loved it because it you know, fired them up and gave them more meaning for, you know, doing their art, which is great for me. You know, it's very rewarding.
Yeah, cool.
Okay, and have you got anything coming out that's going to be more HEMA based?
No, I mean, how many HEMA? Right. Some people have asked for a sequel. If I can think of a decent plot. But I mean, you know, this I pretty much kind of shot my load HEMA fiction-wise in this book. It's about a HEMA teacher who gets invited to a shadowy tournament, and he doesn't want to go because he's not stupid, right? but then you know, the FBI involved, and they're like, we have to bring these people down, and so that sounds a lot like a cheesy movie called Ring of Steel. I think Mark Dacascos was in it, or was that something else? But it's not like that. It's when they actually this tournament, they realize that it's not at all what they would expect, and there's some conflicts and people are torn as far as what to do, and that's where the meaning question comes in. Why do we do HEMA? If we walk away from this, you know, what does that mean? If we do this, what does that mean? And so on and so forth.
Okay, cool, interesting.
Okay, Mike, thank you very much for your time, and thanks for sharing your thoughts with us.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, cool.
Cheers then.
Bye.
Bye.